Dear participants, dear friends, this webinar is dedicated to copyright regulation and when do policy measures in this very field become a trade restriction. This is the first of our three to four webinars dedicated to the topic of intellectual property for our DTI project. The first one is copyright, the second one and the third one will be on the 21st of February and will be dedicated to respectively to patents and to trade secrets. And we may have a fourth one on geographical indication. So this is our IP agenda, basically. And we decided to start with the most difficult part, I would say, which is in the field of copyright. Why? Because copyrights are not registered as such. And therefore, the fluidity, the nature of the right itself renders the entry in categories in a digital trade integration database more difficult. Yet, in order to clarify our ideas in the light of the methodology that Martina, the leader of our project, has brilliantly established, we have invited as a key speaker today, as a central speaker, Aviv Gaon. Why did we invite Aviv Gaon? Aviv Gaon is a researcher and professor at Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel. Israel, which is called the startup country, and therefore is a very tech-oriented country. And Aviv combines also double education with a PhD from York University and close affiliations with the University of Toronto, where he studies the relation between technology and intellectual property and competition law. Toronto being in a country, Canada, which is a civil law and a common law country, and very close, very linked to the US as well. So this is why it's so important that we have Aviv with us today, due to his knowledgeability and also to his interaction with various categories of countries that interest us today for constructing very resilient database and scientifically grounded issue. Aviv made major research not only on AI, on artificial intelligence, but also on fair use and fair dealing. And before his presentation, Martina would wish to recall the methodological issues connected to our database. So Martina, the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks, Laurent. Thanks, Aviv, for accepting our invite. I can quickly present the methodology that concerns copyright so that also everybody is on board and knows what we're talking about. And I apologize in advance because this is not really my field, so it will be very basic. So every suggestion is welcome. Our index is pretty wide and it covers 11 different pillars. So I will just present you the three entries which have to do with copyright. One entry is the entry regarding whether the country is a fair use or fair dealing framework when assessing copyright. And when it comes to this, our approach is to consider fair use as better when it comes to trade compared to fair dealing or the three-step test of the Berne Convention or wide exceptions. And this is where I have my first doubt, because when we created this index, we were looking into several reports, and a lot of work on this issue is done by the US. So the fair use appeared to us to be like better for businesses, but we might be wrong. So as of now, we are giving a better score to countries having fair use than to countries having fair dealing, three-step test, and wide exceptions, while countries not having any of those have the worst score. So this is the scale we are using. but we are very open to change this and adjust it. The second entry is related to the enforcement of copyright online. And here we look at whether there is a high level of piracy when it comes to software, mainly, and digital content. So in this case, we don't really have a specific reference, but when we see that seems to be issues when it comes to piracy online, we consider that we put a high score, so a score that entails a restriction for trade. Otherwise, we put 0, so no restriction. And we are mainly making reference to the USTR report and the watch list on IP. But again, if you have alternative suggestions, this is also an entry that might be improved. And then we have in the pillar related to intermediate liability and content access, we cover again copyright in the framework of safe harbor for intermediaries. And in this case, we are just giving a high score to a country that there's a restriction to digital trade when there is a lack of a safe harbor for intermediaries. And the safe harbor, we also look into cases in which the safe harbor covers or not copyright. And regarding this entry, my question is whether you think that we should create a separate entry only for safe harbor related to copyright, or it is okay to just keep it together with the safe harbor for any other activity considered illegal in the country. And finally, very small question about blocking, because in our index, we also include all those instances in which there is a blocking or filtering of commercial web content. So we don't cover political content because we only care about trade restriction. And when it comes to copyright, so the request by governments to take down a website because there is infringement of copyright, we don't consider this to be a restriction because if the website is only basically providing pirated content. But again, if you think we should do otherwise, if there is another best practice, we will be happy to adjust the methodology in a sense. So that's it on our hand. I just add that in our index, we are not trying to establish what is the best practice globally on copyright. We are just trying to understand what could be the best practice to support digital trade without, but at the same time allow business, to have copyright protected globally. So we're trying to find a balance and look into what countries can do to support digital trade in a good way, let's say. Thank you.
So Aviv, thank you, Martina. I think Aviv, the floor is yours, and then we will interact on topics you will present as well as on Martina's broader agenda.
All right, so wonderful. I'm very happy to be here and thank you for the invitation. Before I start my presentation, just to give you some sort of an outline of what I'm going to do. So I think that your question, Martina, I'll answer them at the end of the presentation because basically what I thought about doing is to give you some sort of an outline about the relevant elements of artificial intelligence and why data is so important for AI. And then to address very specific issues related to AI technology, which is all based on data. And this is just to give you some sort of highlights about what I did during my work in Canada. So part of my work was to give a report to the Canada Parliament, to the Parliament in Canada about these specific issues. And some of their considerations were actually about what we can do in order to facilitate AI-related research, AI-related companies. And in a way, some of their suggestions, I think, might be applicable to your project as well. So I'm going to talk about that too, and maybe offer some ideas as to how we should engage with this type of restrictions and data. So that's just sort of highlights. I'm just trying to upload my presentation. Just a sec. So not too many slides, but yeah, I think okay. All right, so All right, so just feel free to stop me at any time. So I think that I'm going to talk for around 20 to 30 minutes, and then I'll leave some time for questions and discussions. All right, so my presentation is basically divided into three parts. In the first part, I explain why everyone is so hyped about AI and how AI affects so many aspects of our life, which I think it's something that we all feel, especially in the EU. I saw that the EU deals with artificial intelligence in many areas, including copyright, IP, and liability and other concerns and other issues. I talk about the difference between machine learning and deep learning and outline AI potential and challenges. This is a part of my research. I have a very interesting book about AI in the legal context and AI in copyright, which is more AI in copyright is more relevant to the discussion today. And then in the second part, in the second and third parts of the presentation, I address the issues that raised by Martina and explain the importance of data and how to develop legal theory and about data barriers, and maybe to discuss some type of exceptions and limitations around data, which I think very important to us. So I'm always doing that in the beginning of my lectures, because the problem that we have, at least with legal scholars, and you might not feel like that, but in most cases, that's what I feel, that legal scholars do not understand AI technology at all. They do not understand the differences, and I think it's very important to have some sort of common ground for the discussion to understand what is AI and why data is so important for AI, and basically why data is so important for everything today. So today, most people understand the importance of AI research in many areas, including law, from smart contracts to transportation and health. AI bears significant potential. And it is important to explain that AI is not a new trend. It's something that is all around us, at least from the 50s. So it's not new. Alan Turing from Cambridge University started developing those ideas in around the 50s. And since then, we had some ups and downs. And now I think that we are also in the up part of the development. But AI is basically all about learning, teaching computing to learn, the ability to demonstrating traits associated with human behavior. And the current trend or the current wave of progress began around 2010 and is driven by two main factors. The one is, and this is why it's so important, the availability of data from many sources like the internet, social media, Wikipedia. And the second is that since the 20s and at least the 2000, the millennium, we have more and more powerful computers that actually can process this data and this information. And these two elements make what we are considering today the AI development or the AI hype. It's also very important to explain that contrary to common belief, not everything is AI. Everyone likes to say, well, I invented an AI, I have an AI algorithm. But to be honest, most of the things that we see today are not AI, they're something else. And this is, I try to, this is a sketch that I did actually. I didn't copy that from any source in the internet, because I think it helps you understand what is AI. And when you look on all these, circles, so most of what we're doing today basically is what we call deep learning. People are calling, AI, but basically almost all advanced algorithms today are deep learning algorithms. And the most important element about deep learning is the importance of data for the learning process. So we need data, and data is the most important part in the development of this concept. One other element is that, and I actually talk about that in a paper that I published in 2020. And I surfaced something that is also very important for legal scholars, and I call it a conceptual dilemma, or the AI conceptual dilemma. And the problem that I found with AI, at least in the legal context, that AI is something that is not defined, not only in terminology or tech parts, but also for legal scholars. And because we know that it's very important for legal scholars to identify a common statement, a common concept before we start developing the theory, So I thought it was very important to explain what is AI, at least in the legal context. And this is something that I try to do. And I hope that I managed to do it in the paper that I wrote in 2020. So just to give you a sort of explanation about, just to give you very short, what is AI and how this is working. So I told you deep learning is a part of machine learning, which is part of AI. It's all part of the field. But before we can understand what is so special about deep learning, we have to understand what is so special about learning. So usually when we talk about computer science, people think about algorithm, right? Computer science is algorithms. Whenever you want to solve something using your computer, you have to write an algorithm and then to convert the algorithm into some code that you can run on your computer. So this is the basic thing. And so what is the difference between machine learning and deep learning, which is very similar but very different in a way. So I just thought about giving you this very, I think, straightforward example. So here is an image you probably recognize from the Oscars. You remember the time that we didn't have to wear these weird masks on our faces. So everyone was happy and everyone was feeling good about crowding with each other. Today, I don't think we can find this type of picture. But what is the difference between machine learning and deep learning? So here you can see the pixels. The pixels are small dots with color that our brain merges together to see a picture. Then we can easily recognize the many faces. But how we can teach a computer to do that? So the first thing we should do is to understand what is the face thing. The second thing is the features. And how do we recognize this round thing that we look at a face or a nose and so on? Initially what we'll do, we'll highlight this in machine learning. What we'll do, we'll put these squares and we'll start identifying for the computer, what is a face, what is a nose. And the way that the computer is worked, that you give the computer faces and more pictures and more images, and you identify the layers of each picture, and then in time, the computer basically understands to make the difference by itself. So we understand, this is the way that you put, hundreds of pictures to this system, and through this, what we call layers. This is the layers, the neural network. You probably heard this term in some other part, the neural network. And when you put the different images in the neural network, with time, the neural network can understand and can learn the difference. Just to, I don't know if you know that, but feel free to try. Do you know how many pictures do we need to teach the computer the basic differences between a cat or a dog? So do you know how many pictures do we need to use in order to code this very specific algorithm to identify between cats and dogs? Raise a number. I think it will answer. It will give you some sort of understanding why data is so important in this context. Try to guess. How many pictures?
Maybe like hundreds of thousands.
Around 2.5 million pictures. 2.5 million pictures, just to make this the computer will understand this very simple difference between a cat and a dog. And I'm not talking about different types of cats or different types of dogs. I'm just telling you something that is very limited and basic. So think about trying to code and to create algorithms to make this type of identification, to identify certain faces and to provide context to other important elements. So I think this is like the reason it's so important for us, and to understand why data is something that is so important for us. So this was, I tried to do it to minimize this explanation to 5 minutes. And this was to give you the context. And now we're getting into the legal concept. And afterwards, I'm going to talk mostly about copyright and AI exceptions. So obviously, many areas of law are affected by AI developments. Take torts, for example. Discussion is about autonomous vehicles, liability, IP, and there are other elements, human rights. We're talking about human rights all the time, and it's very important. For example, one of the problems that we have with AI technology that it's create bias towards certain minorities, which is something that the EU is definitely wish to find a way to solve. By the way, this might be a very good argument for the governments to explain why they should provide access to data. Because if you provide access to high quality data, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in a second, or I have a question or oh, 1 million. All right. If you provide access to high quality data, that might reduce the bias impact. So that might be some sort of a reasoning for creating, or at least to take out certain limitations or restrictions on data, at least in this context. And by the way, on the left, this is part of a recent project that I published with my supervisor, a book that actually discussed the many elements and impact of AI on different areas of law. So getting to the essence of my presentation, all this was basically to give you some sort of a very short introduction about my research and what I do. And now I'm going to talk to you about something that is not very popular, and I have to say that if you have privacy scholars here in the crowd, so I don't think they're going to like me so much because what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. But this is the part of my research. This is my book that I published a few months ago. And one of the chapters in the book, this is actually the title of this chapter, Resolving Data Barriers. And here I'm going to explain why it's so important to lift the limitations on data, and copyright has it's a very big element in doing that. So as I said before, almost every aspect of human life, from politics to social media, is dependent on data. It makes data the most valuable resource today. And there are many sources for data, like Google, Wikipedia, government data, and of course, social media. The problem is that not all sources are available, and not all the available sources are what we consider good for developing AI technology. Gaining access to what I call high quality data could facilitate innovation and improve access to minority groups, advancing public causes, while low quality data could result in problems like bias. In my research, I highlight how regulation might steer away high quality data from public use. And we usually, and this is one of the problems, usually focus on the output, what AI and other systems do or create, and not the input, how the data affect the outcome. And this is something that, in my opinion, is very important. The issue is that AI requires massive amount of data. I just show you how. And there are a lot of data available, but unfortunately, we don't have access to what we call high quality data because it is protected by regulation or by either technological means. I think that's something that you addressed in your methodology, Martina, like encryption. This is something that the US deals with that a lot. If you remember that the US actually have a specific law that enacted in order to allow encryption. And this is something that scholars like me and other scholars from all around the world raise all the time. The problem that we have with certain encryption, because it's strictly prohibited individual to access data, even though they might be considered fair use or fair dealing that they can use, but they can't do it technically because you have some sort of restrictions that no one can actually find a way to resolve. So this is something that definitely we should discuss, and maybe we can raise that afterward in the discussion as well. So AI can infringe IP, contracts, or privacy laws on several levels. Making digital copies could infringe copyright. Using personal data could infringe privacy regulation. Gathering data using crawlers, which are, you know what is crawlers? Crawlers are algorithms that scan the web for information. It's basically a very simple code, a very simple algorithm, and that could infringe contract law. If you have a website and you have on the website terms of use, which you do have in every website. Any website today have terms of use. And then if you use crawlers and you scrap this information from the website, you basically violated the terms of use. So you violate the contract that were forced between you when you use this website. And in certain cases, it might consider to be even a trespassing. So it might be a liable under torts. So there are so many issues related to to the usage of these programs and the uses of these programs to scrap the data from the internet. And there are several challenges that this barriers facilitate, these data barriers facilitate. I mentioned the issue with good high quality data, but the real problem with this is that it's basically creating monopoles. Like it monopolizes the data by the big tech. They decide how, when, and to what extent they will allocate their data. And this is a problem that I see and research from a competition law perspective. What happened today is that you have the big five, you have Amazon, Facebook, and other big corporations. They have almost limitless access to data, and they can basically dictate who is going to use the data and why. Because if I'm a small or a medium company and I want to have access to data because I want to develop something very interesting, let's think about medicine today and health and other companies. If I'm not having a contract with one of these big companies, or if I want to get into the market, I either have to pay a lot of money to these companies, or I would have to use low quality data. And as I mentioned before, low quality data basically create bias and other problems. So I think this is one of the biggest issues that we are facing today, and copyright play a very important role in that. So, I didn't mention that, but I'm also as a copyright scholar, I'm a public policy copyright scholar. So I'm taking the perspective of why we should allow access to copyright, because it creates social good. So I'm trying to explain why, lifting restrictions for copyright uses for for certain, certain companies, certain issues, it might be good for public causes as well. So that's just one excellent thing that we should think about. So from a theoretical perspective, it is important to emphasize, in my opinion, why data should be considered public good. Just for many of you probably know that in the economic and legal theory, public good are non-excludable, non-rivalrous, meaning the goods consumption by but one does not reduce the availability by others. Putting it in a Lockean argument perspective, private goods are private as long as there is nothing is good to others. Clean air, for example, is considered public good. It's free, and no one could actually ask us to pay to it. So my argument here is that we should not label data as air, because people tend to say, well, you have almost unlimited access to data. This is exactly the argument that some of those companies raising today. You can access data from Google, Wikipedia, and other sources. You have unlimited sources, but the sad truth is that it's not true. You don't have unlimited sources. You actually have a very, very, very limited sources that you can use for specific purposes. And the reason it happened, the reason this is a scenario is because the high quality data is restricted by either copyright, privacy, or contract law. So the argument saying that you have unlimited sources and you have unlimited data, this argument is basically false. And I think that the problem that we have today, at least with policymakers and scholars, that we tend to accept this argument that is made from the big five, the big tech companies, saying that we have high quality data and you can use whatever you want to do. But in fact, this is just it's not true. And moving to the second part of the second argument, the essence of my argument. So the dominant legal field that influence and regulate data, privacy, IP, and to some extent contract law. One barrier, and this is where I just give you the heads up before that people that privacy scholars are not going to like this argument, but we have to understand that one of the main legal barriers today is basically privacy, and privacy. On the conceptual level, and I won't say otherwise, privacy is good and it's very important to protect our data. But like any type of regulation, privacy too comes with a price. And we have to understand the price. The EU GDPR and the recent California CCPR amendment and other type of regulations are basically, very, very strict and harsh laws that implement and implicate our the ability and the availability of data and for other sources. And the emphasis is not that only about individual consent to use the data, but also to make sure corporations explain the process of what and how they are using the data. And this requirement is most difficult to implement in small companies and NGOs, and actually responsible for development of new data explainability, what we call explainability AI. So that's one element. And in contracts, I mentioned before the terms of use, and obviously, what we talk about today is IP, and you can't use copyrighted data. AI can infringe copyright by making digital copies of works and saving them on the hard drives or the cloud. This is all could consider an infringement. And one very important element to emphasize here is where the input infringe copyright, the output might infringe copyright as well. And there is actually a very interesting case that is discussed and addressed in Canada. It's called Basanta in Quebec. And the author, Basanta, created an art factory using an AI that mixes out artworks by randomly generating abstract pictures. This is something you might saw in other websites as well. To train his AI, used many pictures, and one from an artist named Emil Shamendi, and he basically sued him for infringement. And this was a very interesting case because, the difference, and you might argue that there is a difference between the way that you use, the creation. For example, if I'm taking a picture like the picture that you see in the back of my office, and I'm using the picture for the purpose of enjoying the picture as an art, this is one thing. But if I'm using the picture as part of a data set, the purpose of the data set is to train an AI algorithm, I argue that you should and might consider this in a different way. And in my opinion, it should not be considered to be an infringement. So that's a different argument. So it all brings us to what we called text and data exemptions. So what we could do, first of all, we understand that we have privacy issues. We understand we have contract issues. And with those, we have, we don't have a limit. We have limited ways. We can't really find a way to exempt privacy. So if for example, if someone is having health issues and want to use his health data, obviously it's something that you need to get his consent. So in my opinion, the only way that we can find a way to solve it is to look into copyright and to see if we can find a way to exempt copyrights for certain purposes, certain issues. And one mechanism is what we call the text and data exemptions. And there are several jurisdictions that uses these exemptions from last year. Another approach is what we call the fair use or fair dealing exceptions. I'm calling that exceptions, although in most literature you'll find that as calling like a sort of a defense. But from the purpose of this discussion, I would like to frame that as an exception, and I will explain that later. And this is exactly the problem that we have today. We don't have many resolutions. Okay, so I'm just moving on to that part. So getting to the essence. So for example, when you talk about text and data exemptions, so we have the UK in 2014, they have the CDPI include a non-commercial research exemption, and we have in 2016, the EU Commission introduced a new directive that have created this also TDM exemptions. We have Germany and France that introduced TDM exceptions, and obviously Japan in 2010 addressed this type of exemptions. And the US and Canada situation is a bit more complex. Data exemptions in the US are governed mostly by the courts, and the courts' fair use and fair dealing doctrines. And in several cases since 1990, the American courts rendered a use as fair if it was transformative, or in other words, if it created something useful and different. Canada and Israel, by the way, lack an explicit exemption for TDM for AI training purposes. And TDM is basically governed in Canada, Israel, and the US by the fair dealing, fair use doctrines as it developed, as I mentioned, in the courts. And And Canadian courts, another example that I mentioned earlier, Canadian courts have instead chose to strengthen user rights and emphasize fairness important, determine whether a user has taken a substantial part is an essential part of the fair dealing analysis. And the tests to find if a substantial part was taken include both quantitative and qualitative factors. So what is the problem that we have with fair use, which I think this is a very interesting element that we should discuss. So up until today, fair use or fair dealing relied on two core elements that excuse the usage of copyrighted data by computer programs. First, the computer program, computer machine inability to purposely infringe copyright, and then the computer program's machine minimal effect on potential market in a way that is martial to copyright law. AI developments are beginning to challenge those assumptions. Machine learning is distinct, as I said, distinct from basic computer codes, and its algorithm do not require specific instructions and can learn and evolve by acquiring and analyzing data. This represents a marked departure from the simple data gathering, storing, and processing employed by computer programs up until now. And these algorithms could potentially enable the study of a human's author or artist expression and style and learn to employ patterns appropriating the author artistic distinct tone. And this is actually something that is very interesting today in relates to non-fungible tokens and blockchains. People are getting more and more aware of the fact that we can actually learn the computer to mimic almost identically me or other authors or artists, and then the computer basically create my image and create other individual image and maybe create my specific style. Think about famous artists like George R.R. Martin with the Game of Thrones and other artists that the computer can actually learn how to mimic the way that the author express his abilities. And this is something that is very interesting, because if you find a way to duplicate an artist and to duplicate a famous songwriter, or to duplicate even a specific tone or a voice, then it's raised concern as to the immortality of copyright, given that copyright has, you can have a copyright until a certain time, 70 years in certain jurisdictions, in other less. But if you find a way to mimic and to duplicate the author tone, the author style, then it might prolong for a long time, and then it will limit the access for the public for certain songs, writings, arts, and so on. So in the future, the problem that we have with fair use, that in the future courts might make use of productive or constructive dichotomy developed by Justice Blackman, and this is something that I'll just skip that, because I think that's not the part that I want to mention here. So what are the alternatives approach that we have to AI and data barriers? So the question is what we can do to solve that. So relying on fair use as a mechanism for regulating AI raises reasonable concerns. The fair use doctrine does not provide certainty for users, which is one of the problems that I have with fair use. I don't think that fair use might be very useful to deal with those problems, given that, first of all, there is a difference between jurisdictions. What is true for US, Canada, Israel is not true for the EU. And in the EU, they relied heavily on TDM. So I think that maybe, this is one thing that I want to raise here, maybe it will be more prudent to create a certain TDM that is specific to AI-related inventions. And this TDM should be something that will be implemented globally. So you might say that, under fair use, most of the artworks and the other copyright materials might use the copyright and the fair use as a defense. But for AI-related purposes, we should create some sort of an international TDM exemption that will be specific for users of AI. And in certain countries, you might find to say, well, so I want to use this only for causes that I think that I value, that are very important. This approach was, discussed in Canada, and eventually the Canadian Parliament decided against implementing this type of TDM in Canada. They decided to go to to implement something that is more, related or similar to what happened in the courts in the US for use. But I think that it's not very useful. And at least for AI purposes, I think it would be more prudent to find a way to implement TDM in that sense. Another approach that we might use royalties. So royalties can be applied when data is used partially or wholly to develop algorithm for commercial purposes, which is actually one of the problems that we had with the case in Canada that I mentioned. So it always comes to that, people saying, why should I allow other AI, coders and computer science to use my data without royalties? And the problem that the computer scientist has that I can't really pinpoint the impact that your data did for my computer. So the solution for that is actually a tech-oriented solution. So people are saying maybe we can use blockchain technology that can allow us to pinpoint the exact use that we did with your data, with your copyrighted data. And in that way, we can find a way to provide royalties. And then we can actually calculate and measure the impact that your creation was for our code or for our invention. And in that way, we can actually allow access to more copyrighted related data. And that might solve some of the problem that we have with these issues today. One, I think, example in that relate is the Marrakesh Treaty. So we had a very, I think, I don't know if you remember, there is an initiative that started at the beginning of the last decade to create some sort of international treaty that will allow access for the visually impaired for copyrighted material. So if a library wishes to take certain books and to change, like to make this book accessible to the visually impaired, they can use it under certain terms. So the Marrakesh Treaty was, I think, one of the last international initiatives related to copyright. And I think that when you think about finding a way to solve some of the restrictions and problems, maybe an international treaty like the Marrakesh for AI-related invention is a good approach, because it might allow us to solve some of the problems that I mentioned today. So I can keep talk on and on about all those issues, but I think that I can conclude the presentation here and maybe allow you to ask questions and to address some of the issues that I mentioned here.
Thank you very much, Aviv. I just have a last very quick comment concerning the possibility to do a Marrakesh Treaty like treaty on AI. I'm very cautious because I followed very much the Marrakesh Treaty negotiations, and certainly also the creation of the WIPO Internet Treaties, the WCT, and the WPT, and there would be a divide between the North and the South that would make that developing countries would raise the bar, and therefore it's not technically possible. I think it is the aim is ideal, but the feasibility in the current let's say North-South divide and possibly a new East-West divide would not really.
Unfortunately, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's and I should have said that it's an idealistic way of thinking. When we are scholars, always try to think about things idealistic. I actually published in 2015 a paper about that. I agree, but I think that in one way or the other, some of the problems we are raising today, and this is part of your project, is trying to find something that we can use on a global scale. So we have to find common ground to address those issues. And maybe a Marrakesh Treaty is not the solution, but we have to find a way to convince the partners from mainly from the US and North America to agree to a certain way of developing at least shared values that we can all agree upon, and then maybe to allow access to this type of data.
Excellent. So I have a few questions on my agenda, but I would wish first to open the floor to our colleagues in particular on what reconciles your presentation with the database the team is working upon. So my question would be on safe harbor and Article 17 in Europe and so on. But are there other questions? Are there questions from the audience? Martina, you have comments?
I have a quick one.
Yes.
Just following your presentation, I was thinking it might be too early to include in our methodology something specific on AI, but we can consider this. But would it be an option if we included an entry on the text data mining exception and verify in each law if there is such exception, for example, because we don't take this into
I think it's very important, and I think that it's something that most countries will find very useful. As I mentioned in my presentation, I try to convince the Canadian Parliament as part of the research that I did there that it is important to include that. But the problem that we have with the TDM is a problem that is oriented in the difference between continental law and common law. So common law countries, that they like the most vague, abstract terminology of fair use and fair dealing. As a common scholar as well. In Israel, the same situation, but the problem is that it's not good for tech. It's not good for tech. So the vague concepts are not very good for tech, and they are not very good for innovation. So I think that answering your question, I think it's very important to include that. And we see the impact on other countries. I mentioned Japan, but there are other countries that in the East that are actually taking this approach as well. So I think it would be useful.
I completely share your views, Aviv. I think it would be very important that we introduce this element in our methodology. Are there any questions from our audience? I know Ruben perhaps wanted to raise some questions.
Yeah, I have several questions, but I will just make a quick one and maybe let Professor Manderioux to make his. I have a question on the sui generis right of databases, since you were actually mentioning internet scrolling and how to extract data from internet sites, because in the European Union, you know that we have this database sui generis right that is actually granted when you make a substantial investment on the organization, verification, or retention of such data. But I would like to know what's your opinion on that, in particular, considering that from my experience, actually it is a right that is in theory is granted to many companies that do such things that are covered under the scope of such right, so to speak. But in practice, I don't see any enforcement on that, at least from my perspective. So on the one hand, I would like to know what's your opinion on that, maybe also on the comparative law perspective. And the second one, what do you think this right is actually useful?
Wow, that's a very very interesting and important question, Ruben. I think that you touched a very sensitive point, because I believe that sui generis rights are important, and I think that this is one of the issues that I try to raise again in Canada and also in Israel, and in the US they also consider that I think from time to time. But again, this is like taking the perspective of theory-based, so we want to have a sui generis rights because we think it will be valuable, and people, at least scholars, legal scholars like this, type of rights, but in practice, it's not useful. So then, you face a situation in which you have enacted a law, and it took a lot of effort to do that, but in practice, either it's not useful or, companies are not really willing to, they look to find some loopholes that they can use in order to limit access for that purposes. So in practice, I think that sui generis, at least in relate to AI, are not very useful. And the problem, by the way, it's not only what I just said, the difference between practical aspects and policy and theory aspects, but it also defined in the way that it's very hard to define what is considered to be an AI, or what is considered to be a data related to AI. So how you can frame the problem that we have in the legal context is that we are having serious obstacles in the definition part. So we can't find a way to define some of those issues. And this is the reason why sui generis legislation in these areas are not very effective.
Thank you. It was
no, but it's I think it's a very important point, and we should. I mean, this is something that we should definitely, look into and discuss, because I would love to see a way that we can find a way to frame a better, a framework for sui generis laws and relates to what we do, data and artificial intelligence, machine learning.
Yeah, actually, the European Parliament has reviewed the Green Book issued by the European Commission that gives a mitigated analysis on the effects of the European directive.
Oh, interesting.
So it's really in line with what you have mentioned, Aviv. It could be interesting if we want to pursue in this matter to consult ESCAP, in particular because the only country apart from the EU with such legislation is the Republic of Korea. So after all, we have the EU and the Republic of Korea and the rest of the planet. So fundamentally, it's quite an issue that may also interest ESCAP in a way.
Good.
I don't know, Professor, whether you want me to go ahead, since my other question is a bit related to the previous one, which relates on data mining.
On data mining, perhaps yes, you could go ahead, Ruben, on data mining, and I have a last one on safe harbor. Yeah.
Okay, but this is a very quick one. Actually, it's kind of related, since there are several countries that either under fair use exception or through ad hoc exceptions, such as the one introduced by the corporate directive in the EU, allowing to some extent the data mining for certain purposes. For instance, in the EU, you have the let's say the non-profit data mining exception, and you have another one which is broader but is subject to additional circumstances, such as there is not a third-party reserve rights of such a data set, and so on and so forth. I would like to know whether you know any cases, or what's your opinion on this, and since we don't have a lot of practice, or we have not seen yet how this will crystallize in practice, what will happen with this. I would like to know what's your take on the data mining exceptions.
All right. Again, it's a very good question, because you're exactly taking the important issues here. So there is and I'll say something in general. There is a very interesting difference between commercial and non-commercial, uses, and we find these differences not only in TDM. We find these differences in fair use and fair dealing as well. Because I don't know if you know that, but for example, if you take under Canadian law, fair use, you might not be successful for commercial purposes. But what is the problem? The problem is that when you deal with technology, especially AI-related technology, even in areas that are very important for the public use, most of them are commercial, because you won't be able to find a scientist or an investor or a company that is willing to do something without any commercial aspect. So the problem that we have with TDM that is limited to non-commercial uses, it's basically useless. Because if you do want to, to promote certain public causes, you have to take under consideration. So part of this, you don't have to have the whole part, but part of that will probably have to make some profit for certain partners. You cannot produce, and we see that today in relation to the universities. So there are many universities around the world that are promoting research, right? But I think that in most cases, computer science research oriented is with some sort of partnership with the industry. So even if you want to create a research based with a university, but one of the partners is an industry based and you want to use the element of this research as part of their company, it might not be protected under TDM or in certain countries under fair use. And that's a problem because you created some beautiful mechanism that can help us doing things that we want to do, but then it's not really adaptable to that type of work. So you didn't do much. So in my opinion, we have to, when we consider TDM, it has to be something that will be feasible on practice. So you have to be something that take into account the fact that part of the uses are going to be commercial. And I think that's something that we can live with. You don't have to have a TDM for all purposes. You have to define, maybe you can define certain sectors. For example, you can say that TDM in health, in transportation, and maybe in other social causes that is important for us as a nation or as a country to promote. On those cases, we will allow partnership with other industry-based companies that will gain something from that. So I think that's something that is very important, and it's unfortunate that in countries that made this amendment, I think it's one of them I mentioned in my presentation, the UK, that made this change, they strictly prohibited commercial causes from that exception, which is something that I think is you didn't do much at all.
Thank you, Aviv. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruben, for this steering the conversation into something that I actually have something to say.
Yeah, exactly. It's excellent. So I may have a question related to the safe harbor policies and how in our database we should consider this issue. Article 17 of the European Union Digital Single Market Directive brings issues there. US legislation, including the now oldish DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, establish some rules. How do you see that we should move on this for our database?
Well, so safe harbors are very important. I actually thought about that when you start raising the question. So I don't know if you know that, but in the US, there is a very interesting debate about safe harbor related to cyber technology. So in the US, they actually made some amendments to the law recently, and they allowed safe harbors for hackers. So one of the issues that they dealt with in the US was what happened with the good hackers, so the one that are actually looking into companies, find errors, find problems, find loopholes. And those hackers actually inform those loopholes and the problems to the companies or to the government. So before they changed the law, what happened is that those hackers were considered to be felons. There might be prosecutions because it's a felony to try to hack into a computer, right? But they created these safe harbors to incentivize those individuals to actually find those loopholes, and in that way can promote public causes. So I think that finding a way to create safe harbors for using certain data for certain purposes is something that we should definitely think about and promote. And maybe, and what we're trying to do here, and I think this is part of the the project, we want to find partners not only within the EU, because it's very easy for us. And I consider Israel as part of the EU, at least in certain aspects. We're more closely to the EU than the States. But what is important for the EU in general is to find ways to get into the US discussion as well. Because if we'll be able to convince the US why it's important to implement those rules, it will be easier for us to find this common causes that we can work together. So if you take what the US did in relate to cyber in safe harbors, and to find a way to convince them that this methodology is good for data-related issues, then you can build your bridge, and you can find a way to explain, your arguments in a way that you can convince US legislators and US policymakers to understand the reasonings behind those, those limitations and those safe harbors.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ruben, you want to add something on this?
Well, maybe I agree with you both. I personally provide the relevance of, but that's my personal view, of course, provide the relevance of copyright in the digital age. I may well treat this as a paramount matter, maybe separated from other safe harbor exceptions, since in my opinion, together with some terrorism or maybe child abuse and that type of topics that have led the way in the safe harbor regulation, I think copyright has a paramount importance and is in connected to monitoring obligations and filtering obligations, and in that area, I think that's my view, that copyright has something else to say. And since actually most of the information, either user-generated content or linear content that is provided from platforms to the users, is oftentimes protected to copyright, knowing what's under the scope and what platform has to do and what not is really important for the digital economy and for digital trade as such. So I would treat this as a separate topic, but that's, as I repeat, that's my view.
So just I agree that it should be separate. I just, what I meant to say is that we can find a way to frame the issue in a way that can a US policymaker can understand, and in that way we might convince them to implement something on a broader scale. But I do agree that obviously cyber law, cybersecurity is completely different. It's not, not the same purposes, not the same goals. But when we deal with data, there are some similarities that we can think about, at least in that level.
Excellent. I would wish to give the floor to Nano Mulder from the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Nano, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating seminar so far, and I'm not a lawyer, so it's difficult to grasp different of the concepts you're dealing with, but it's what I find very interesting as a discussion, and I'm looking also at the innovation standpoint, is the certain tension that exists between data protection on the one hand and innovation on the other. And I was wondering, with regard to the scores we are attributing to different elements of data protection. And as I learned as an economist, that there's this tension between, on the one hand, of course, companies that have a certain interest that data and publication and other issues are protected, because they need to extract a certain rent from an investment they made, so they can earn a certain profit on their investment. On the other hand, of course, if this data protection is too heavy, it will impede, it will slow down innovation by other companies, or in a sense that these innovations and data are shared. So I was wondering, Aviv, and also I'm asking Martina, what should be the correct way of scoring? Because on the one hand, we want, of course, data to be protected, and that promotes innovation. But again, as Aviv was saying, most of the data are controlled nowadays by a very small number of companies. So if that's really the main source of our data and the source of innovation of a large number of companies, then of course it will limit innovation. So in terms of the score, what should be the correct way of scoring? So if we have a high degree of data protection, then it might be good for the country and the companies in the country, but on the other hand, it will limit data flows and innovation and digital trade in the rest of the world. So I see a certain tension there. What is your advice?
Should I start? Whatever.
Yes, please.
All right. So, wow, thank you for this wonderful question. I have to say that I'm always enjoying to have this type of discussion because it's theory-based. This is part of the research that I did, and I published a book, and several chapters actually deals with that balance. Because, you know, when you think about this, what you describe, this is basically the U.S. Constitution. So if you look into the U.S. Constitution, so the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution stated that they want to give companies, copyright protection and patent protection to incentivize them to create, because they assume that you need to get some sort of revenue royalties for your invention. Otherwise, you won't be incentivized to create. But the problem that we see today, and this is the issue that we have to deal with today, that, you know, in many parts, in inventing and creating and even amateur creating today, this is not related to to anything that the author actually did, because I can take a computer and I can program a computer to do certain things, and you will do it automatically. So what is the reasoning in providing this type of monopolization power to those companies in areas in which the computer or the human influence on the invention or the creation is so limited? So I think that today, and this is again the balance might be, we might have to think about different ways to change the balance. So the scoring, and I'm getting to the first part of your question, the scoring has to take into account the fact that creativity today and invention today are different in a way that they did 30 or 40 years ago. So if 30 or 40 years ago, you put a lot of value and input on the human part of the creation, today we know that a lot of the part of the creativity and the invention is created by the computer, and the computer creating the computer doesn't need incentive to be incentivized in order to create. You need to incentivize the human to create a computer, but afterwards, when the computer was created, you have to put some sort of, and I call it some sort of a barrier. So the time, the protection that you allocate to the program should be limited. So again, we need to take these changes into account in evaluating this type of methodology and creating a different scoring than we might have used to do 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, just quickly adding on this, the issue of data privacy is a very complex one, and we have addressed it already in one webinar. Next week, we're going to have another, and still a lot of questions are open when it comes to how to find the right balance between these different rights. And it is very hard to try to find a balance when on one hand you have a lot of countries, not just the EU 27, but around 80 countries in the world which are already using a GDPR approach and considering data protection to be like a human right. So it's really hard to find exceptions there. So one thing which is interesting, which the EU is doing, is to support portability of data and to promote now with the proposal on the DSA to support and promote portability of anonymized data or pseudonymized, which will be an interesting thing to consider for our dataset. But when it comes to, in general, when it comes to data protection, we are considering strict conditions to be a problem, and this is based on some econometric analysis and studies, but overall it's very hard to state, of course, that strict and strong rights on data protection represent a barrier. So finding the balance is very hard, and finding the right criteria to consider a certain measure to be problematic or not for trade is complex. We're trying to find a balance.
And this is why your project is so important, because I think that what you're trying to do is to putting a scoring in a table and to highlight the problems and to address the problems, which some scholars try to evade. So I think that facing the problem is the issue that we need to deal with.
Yeah, our approach, just to add quickly, what is interesting is that we are trying to avoid the word barrier, and we are just referring to restrictions, which already makes this easier, because we don't say this is a problem per se, we're just saying this creates cost for businesses. And this is undeniable, so it makes it easier to work around this problem.
Very good. I think at this very stage, I think we should really thank Aviv and all those who spoke for their participation, and also Aviv for your preparation and involvement in our activity. If I may summarize, I think that at this stage, we may need to slightly adjust the copyright parameters. Perhaps I could work with Ruben, or Ruben could work with me on this. We would recommend changes to, or more than changes, adjustments, I would say, to Martina, Daniele, and to the whole leading group of the project. And from there, we will be able, therefore, thanks to Aviv's enlightenment and also speakers' comments, to fine-tune our methodology and make it more effective for copyright.
Many thanks. And if I can just add, I will leave one word to Eric, because we already have our next webinar set up, and we will send the invites tomorrow. So if, and Eric is in charge of it, so if you can very quickly tell what the next webinar will be about, then yeah, in the meantime, I will put a link if you want to register to the our newsletter to get the invite.
Yes, I'm unmuted. Yeah, so next week already, the 14th of February, we have a similar webinar, but not about this topic, of course, but about the topic of domestic data policy. So we'd like to ask precisely sort of some of the items that we discussed, the extent to which policies that are regulating the use of domestic data form a restriction. And so we have had, like in the previous index that we created, like a couple of measures in there. And we would like to ask experts whether they really form, according to their opinion, a restriction to trade or not. And as Martina said, how to deal with them, those restrictions, if they form a barrier. Because obviously, I mean, you know, there's this fine, delicate balance between economic interest, but then also non-economic sort of interest of a government. And so striking this right balance, that will be sort of the central theme of that discussion. And so what are we sort of talking about? I mean, we are talking about the lack of comprehensive legal framework for data protection. We also talk about minimum and maximum period of data retention, the requirement to perform an impact assessment or to have a data protection officer, and the requirement to allow the government to access personal data collected without a court order or warrant. So these are the 4 items that we will be discussing, and we have 2 invited speakers and potentially a third, not the speaker, but an important attendant will also comment on these kind of issues, which is Fabian Delcroix from the European Commission, Tunde Fafunwa from the UN, Fafunwa, sorry, who is a special advisor to the UN for the UN Africa on digital trade, and then Professor Greenleaf, who potentially might join us. He's very busy and just came back from holiday, and so he said he will do his best to attend the seminar and give a couple of comments on this issue. So yeah, that's for next week, and hopefully you'll all be there.
Excellent. So thank you very much. Martina, I let you close the activity. Thanks to Aviv also for the pre-interaction, for also your proposal to see how to include Israel in the data set, and that will be reviewed with Martin and the whole group. And we will try also to therefore advance on this, on the aspect of today's topic. Looking forward for next week's webinar as well.
Thank you. Thank you again, everybody. Have a nice day.